In this episode, we're going to take the broad idea of secure configuration and make it feel like a concrete, defensible discipline that applies no matter what kind of system you are looking at. Beginners often think secure configuration is just a checklist of settings, like turning off a few features and setting strong passwords. But in a PCI assessment context, configuration is really about controlling how systems behave so they do not become easy entry points into the cardholder data environment, CDE. The phrase across every platform matters because payment environments rarely use one operating system, one database, or one device type, and weak configuration on any platform can become a bridge into the rest of the environment. A QSA is not trying to be the person who knows every setting on every system, but they are expected to recognize what strong configuration management looks like, what evidence proves it is working, and what common failures make configurations drift over time. When you can reason about configuration as a system of standards, control of change, and verification of operating effectiveness, you stop thinking in terms of isolated tweaks and start thinking like an assessor who can defend conclusions. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A good starting point is understanding why configuration is so central to security, because it explains why so many requirements and testing procedures care about it. Most real attacks do not begin with an attacker inventing a new technique. They begin with an attacker finding a system that is exposed, misconfigured, or left in a default state that was never meant to be used in production. Default accounts, unnecessary services, weak encryption settings, overly permissive access, and unpatched components are common paths of entry because they create predictable weaknesses. In a payment environment, a single misconfigured server or device can become the foothold that leads to broader compromise, especially if segmentation is weak or administrative access is broad. Secure configuration is therefore not a one-time hardening project. It is a continuous discipline that keeps systems in a safe state as they are deployed, updated, and maintained. The QSA perspective is that configuration matters because it is one of the clearest ways to reduce attack surface, and reducing attack surface is one of the most practical ways to protect cardholder data. When you connect configuration to attack surface, you can explain why configuration controls are not busy work, but a direct risk reduction mechanism. To enforce secure configurations, you first need standards that define what secure means for each platform, because without standards, enforcement becomes subjective. A standard is a documented baseline that describes how a system should be configured for its role, including what services should be enabled, what should be disabled, what access controls should exist, and what logging and security features must be present. Standards must be platform-aware, because what makes sense for a point-of-sale device is not the same as what makes sense for a database server, and what makes sense for a cloud workload is not the same as what makes sense for a network appliance. At the same time, standards should be consistent in spirit across platforms, meaning they all aim to reduce unnecessary exposure, restrict privileged access, and ensure security settings are deliberate rather than default. Beginners sometimes think standards are rigid and annoying, but they are what make enforcement possible, because you cannot measure compliance with a configuration baseline unless you know what the baseline is. Standards also support scalability, because when you have many systems, you need a repeatable way to configure them consistently. A QSA evaluating configuration controls is often evaluating whether standards exist, whether they are appropriate, and whether people actually build systems to those standards. Once standards exist, enforcement depends on how systems are built and deployed, because the easiest way to keep configuration consistent is to make the secure configuration the default build. If every system is configured by hand, enforcement becomes fragile because human memory is inconsistent and shortcuts appear under time pressure. A stronger approach is building from controlled images, templates, or documented build processes that embed secure configuration decisions from the start. This matters across platforms because each platform has its own ways of drifting, such as servers accumulating extra services, databases gaining unnecessary accounts, or endpoint devices being modified for convenience. The key idea is that secure configuration should not rely on hero effort. It should rely on a repeatable method that produces consistent results. From a QSA mindset, the question is whether the organization can demonstrate that new systems start in a hardened state and that this hardening is predictable. If the answer depends on a particular person being careful, the control is weaker because it does not scale. If the answer depends on a defined, repeatable build process, the control is stronger because it is resilient to staffing changes and workload spikes. Another essential part of configuration enforcement is controlling change, because even a perfectly hardened system can become insecure through well-intentioned modifications. People open ports to fix problems, enable services to support new features, add accounts for temporary access, and adjust security settings to reduce friction, and each of those changes can weaken the baseline. A control holds when changes are deliberate, approved, tested, and documented, and when there is a clear reason for every deviation from the baseline. Change management is not just a process for avoiding downtime. It is also a process for preventing security drift. This is especially important in payment environments where scope reduction depends on boundaries and minimal pathways, because a single configuration change can create new connectivity into the CDE. A QSA should be able to evaluate whether change controls exist for systems in scope, whether changes are reviewed with security in mind, and whether emergency changes are later reviewed and corrected. Beginners sometimes assume that if change tickets exist, security is handled, but tickets can be meaningless if approvals are rubber-stamped. Enforcement means the change process is actually respected and that security impact is considered in a consistent way. Secure configuration across every platform also requires you to think about service reduction and role clarity, because systems become risky when they do more than they need to do. A system that runs unnecessary services exposes more attack surface, and it also becomes harder to patch and monitor because there are more components to manage. Role clarity means each system has a defined purpose, and its configuration supports that purpose rather than turning the system into a general-purpose toolbox. In a PCI context, role clarity is powerful because it supports narrower access, simpler monitoring, and clearer evidence about what the system should look like. When roles are unclear, configurations become inconsistent because different administrators make different choices based on their preferences. This inconsistency undermines sampling because you cannot confidently sample a few systems if every system is unique. It also undermines incident response because it becomes harder to tell whether a change is normal or suspicious. A pro-level enforcement mindset encourages role-based baselines that reduce variability. A QSA will often look for whether systems in the CDE have clear roles and whether those roles are reflected in consistent configuration patterns. Access control is a major dimension of secure configuration because configuration is not only about settings, it is also about who can change settings. If privileged access is broad and poorly tracked, configurations drift because too many people can modify systems without oversight. If privileged access is tightly controlled, changes are more deliberate and easier to review. Across platforms, this means ensuring that administrative accounts are limited, that default accounts are removed or secured, that shared accounts are avoided where possible, and that access is granted through consistent processes. It also means paying attention to service accounts and system-to-system credentials, because those can become persistent backdoors if not managed carefully. A QSA evaluating configuration enforcement will consider whether access control policies align with operational reality and whether evidence exists that privileged access is reviewed and removed when no longer needed. Beginners sometimes focus on technical settings and forget the governance around who can alter those settings, but governance is what makes enforcement sustainable. When you control who can change configurations, you make it easier for baseline standards to remain true over time. Logging and monitoring settings are also part of secure configuration because they determine whether you can detect misconfiguration, compromise, or unauthorized changes. A system might be configured securely today, but if logging is weak, you may not notice when it becomes insecure tomorrow. This is why secure configurations often include requirements for enabling relevant logs, protecting log integrity, and ensuring logs are collected and reviewed appropriately. Across platforms, logging looks different, but the principle is the same. You want sufficient visibility to detect security-relevant events, and you want that visibility to be consistent and reliable. In ACDE context, logging is also part of defensibility because it provides evidence that controls are operating and that the environment is monitored. A QSA should think of logging configuration as both a detection control and an evidence generator. If logs are missing, noisy, or inaccessible, it becomes harder to demonstrate that controls are working and harder to investigate issues. Enforcing secure configuration, therefore, includes ensuring that visibility settings are deliberate and maintained. Patch and vulnerability management are often discussed as their own topics, but they are deeply intertwined with secure configuration because configuration standards often assume current software and controlled versions. A system that is configured securely but running outdated components may still be exposed to known vulnerabilities that bypass the intended configuration protections. Across platforms, patching behavior can vary widely, and this variability can create uneven risk if some systems are updated and others lag. Enforcement means having a method for keeping systems updated in a consistent way and documenting that method so it can be validated. It also means understanding exceptions, such as systems that cannot be patched quickly due to operational constraints, and ensuring those exceptions are managed with risk awareness and additional controls when needed. A QSA will look for whether patching is treated as an ongoing control with evidence over time, not as an occasional project. When patching is weak, configuration enforcement becomes less meaningful because known vulnerabilities can undermine hardened settings. A mature environment treats configuration and patching as part of one continuous maintenance discipline. Across every platform, one of the hardest challenges is configuration drift, which is the slow movement away from the baseline over time due to small changes, manual fixes, and inconsistent practices. Drift happens even in well-intentioned teams because systems are complex and operational needs evolve. Enforcement means having a method to detect drift, assess it, and correct it, rather than discovering drift only during an audit scramble. Drift detection can be supported by periodic reviews, automated checks, or comparison to baselines. But the key is that it happens regularly and produces evidence. If drift is discovered, enforcement also requires a correction process that is timely and documented, because drift that remains uncorrected becomes the new normal. This is where sampling and evidence strategy connect, because if drift detection is strong and baselines are consistent, sampling becomes more defensible since you can reasonably assume systems stay aligned. If drift detection is weak, sampling becomes risky because any sampled system might not represent others. A QSA will often judge the maturity of configuration enforcement by how the organization handles drift, because drift is the real test of whether standards are living or merely written. Virtualization and cloud environments add specific twists to configuration enforcement because they often rely heavily on templates, automation, and shared management planes. When done well, this can be a huge advantage because automation can produce consistent hardened builds at scale and can reduce manual mistakes. When done poorly, automation can replicate insecure configurations at scale, and a single bad template can create hundreds of vulnerable systems quickly. Enforcement in these environments means controlling templates, controlling who can change them, reviewing changes carefully, and validating that deployed systems match the intended baseline. It also means managing identity and permissions in the control plane, because control plane access can change network rules, spin up new systems, and alter security settings rapidly. A QSA looking at configuration enforcement in cloud settings will pay attention to whether the organization treats templates and policies as critical assets that require governance. This is not about knowing every cloud feature. It is about recognizing that modern environments enforce configuration through automation, and automation must be governed to remain secure. When automation is governed, configuration enforcement becomes both stronger and easier to prove. From an exam perspective, questions about secure configuration often test whether you understand that enforcement is about repeatability, governance, and evidence, not about memorizing specific setting names. Answers that focus only on one-time hardening without addressing ongoing change and drift are usually weaker because they ignore how systems evolve. Answers that rely on policy statements without showing how configurations are verified are also weaker because they confuse intent with effectiveness. Strong answers typically include having documented baselines, building systems to those baselines consistently, controlling who can change configurations, reviewing and approving changes, monitoring for drift, and validating through evidence over time. They also recognize that secure configuration is platform-specific in details but consistent in purpose across platforms. If you stay anchored to the idea that secure configuration reduces attack surface and supports defensible control operation, you can evaluate answer options by asking which approach would still hold true months after the assessment. The exam is rewarding sustainable security thinking, because sustainable thinking is what protects cardholder data between validation cycles. To conclude, enforcing secure system configurations across every platform is about creating a living baseline discipline that keeps systems in a hardened, controlled state as they are deployed, changed, and maintained. It starts with clear standards that define what secure looks like for each platform, and with build processes that make secure configuration the default rather than an afterthought. It depends on change control that prevents convenience exceptions from becoming permanent weaknesses, and on access governance that limits who can modify critical settings. It includes logging and monitoring settings that provide visibility and support evidence, and it aligns with patching and vulnerability management so that hardened configurations are not undermined by outdated software. Drift detection and correction are central because drift is the natural enemy of consistency, and handling drift well is what makes sampling defensible and boundaries credible. In modern environments, automation and templates can strengthen enforcement dramatically, but only when they are governed as critical security assets. When you can see configuration enforcement as a system of standards, governance, verification, and continuous maintenance, you are thinking like a QSA who can defend conclusions across any platform, which is exactly what this credential expects.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.